In the early months of 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture where American forces were closing in on territories that had been seized by the Japanese Empire years earlier. The Philippines, that scattered archipelago of tropical islands in the western Pacific, had become a symbol of American determination and pride, not merely because of its strategic value, but because of a promise made by one man who had been forced to flee in the dark days of 1942. General Douglas MacArthur, a figure of towering ambition and unshakable conviction, had departed the islands under orders from Washington, leaving behind thousands of soldiers who would eventually march into captivity along the Bataan Death March. As he boarded the PT boat that would carry him to safety, he spoke words that would echo through the years of brutal occupation. "I shall return." Now, nearly 3 years later, with American industrial might fully mobilized and Japanese defenses crumbling across the Pacific, MacArthur was positioned to make good on that vow. The liberation of the Philippines had begun with landings at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, a massive naval and amphibious operation that had drawn the remnants of the Japanese fleet into a desperate battle. By January of 45, American forces were ready to assault Luzon, the largest and most important island of the archipelago, home to the capital city of Manila. For MacArthur, the capture of Manila was not simply a military objective, but a personal crusade. Thousands of American and Allied prisoners languished in camps throughout the city, their survival uncertain with each passing day. The Philippine government in exile, which had accompanied MacArthur to Australia and then returned with him, desperately needed to re-establish its legitimacy by reclaiming the seat of power. Every day that Manila remained under Japanese control was another day that the prestige and authority of that government remained in question. Yet within the American command structure, significant disagreements emerged about how best to approach the liberation of the capital. General Walter Kruger, a methodical and cautious commander who led the Sixth Army, advocated for a measured advance. His forces had landed at Lingayen Gulf on the western coast of Luzon, and Kruger believed it was essential to consolidate their positions, secure supply lines, and ensure that Japanese units still operating in the mountainous interior could not strike at their flanks or rear. The terrain of Luzon was unforgiving, with jungle-covered mountains and narrow roads that could easily become death traps if enemy forces launched coordinated attacks from concealed positions. Kruger had seen too many operations falter because of overextension and inadequate logistics. He wanted to build up strength methodically before pushing south toward the capital. MacArthur, however, was having none of it. His intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were preparing to destroy Manila systematically, as they had done in other cities facing recapture. He feared that delay would give the enemy time to execute prisoners, demolish infrastructure, and reduce the Pearl of the Orient to ruins. Moreover, MacArthur harboured hopes that the Japanese might declare Manila an open city, sparing it from destruction as the Americans themselves had done when abandoning the capital in December 1941. That declaration had allowed the Japanese to occupy Manila without fighting, preserving its historic buildings and civilian population. MacArthur believed there was a chance, however slim, that the enemy might reciprocate. Time was therefore of the essence, and MacArthur ordered an immediate advance, overruling Kruger's more conservative instincts. On the Japanese side, the situation was equally complex and riven with internal contradictions. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had orchestrated the lightning conquest of Singapore in 1942, now commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines. Yamashita was a realist who understood that the military situation was hopeless. American air and naval supremacy meant that reinforcements would never arrive, and the industrial capacity that might have supplied his forces with adequate weapons and ammunition simply did not exist. Yamashita had already decided that attempting to defend Manila would be suicidal and tactically pointless. The city was indefensible against an enemy with overwhelming firepower, and trying to hold it would only result in the destruction of his entire force for no strategic gain. His plan was to withdraw into the rugged mountains of northern Luzon, where the terrain favored defensive operations and where his troops could wage a protracted guerrilla campaign that would tie down American forces and delay the inevitable defeat. To implement this strategy, Yamashita issued orders to General Shizuo Yokoyama, who commanded the Shimbu group responsible for the Manila area. Those orders were clear: evacuate the city, withdraw to defensive positions in the mountains, and place all naval personnel and installations under Army command for coordinated action. It was a sensible military plan that would have spared Manila from destruction while preserving Japanese combat power for a longer struggle. However, the Imperial Japanese military was not a monolithic organization. The rivalry between Army and Navy was intense and sometimes bordered on the absurd, with each service pursuing its own objectives and often refusing to cooperate with the other. This institutional dysfunction would have catastrophic consequences for Manila. Vice Admiral Denshiji Okochi, who commanded naval forces in the Manila area, had no intention of following Yamashita's orders. The Navy maintained its own chain of command and its own strategic priorities, and Okochi issued instructions that directly contradicted the Army's withdrawal plan. He ordered Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force, to hold the city at all costs. The reasoning behind this decision was twofold. First, Manila contained extensive naval installations, warehouses, supply depots, and repair facilities that the Navy considered vital to defend. Second, and perhaps more importantly, there was an element of vengeance and twisted honor involved. Iwabuchi had previously commanded the battleship Kirishima, which had been sunk during the naval battles around Guadalcanal in November 1942. That loss had been a humiliation that Iwabuchi and his superiors had never forgotten. Defending Manila to the death was seen as an opportunity to redeem that failure and demonstrate the fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Iwabuchi was a career naval officer who had spent his life at sea, commanding warships and leading sailors in battle. He had no experience in urban warfare or land combat, but he accepted his orders with the fatalistic determination that characterized so many Japanese officers in the final stages of the war. Loyal to his naval superiors rather than to the army command structure, Iwabuchi began gathering forces for the defense of Manila. What he assembled was a motley collection of approximately 17,000 men, a force that bore little resemblance to a conventional combat unit. There were sailors from ships that had been sunk in Manila Bay, naval infantry who had lost their vessels, mechanics and technicians from shore installations, anti-aircraft gunners whose weapons had been destroyed by American air raids, and even civilian workers who had been drafted into service. The force included Koreans and Taiwanese who had been conscripted into auxiliary units, men who had no particular loyalty to Japan and little combat training. It was a desperate gathering of survivors and stragglers, united only by Iwabuchi's order to fight to the death. The equipment available to this makeshift garrison was woefully inadequate for the task ahead. There were no tanks, no heavy artillery pieces, and a severe shortage of standard infantry weapons like rifles and machine guns. Iwabuchi's men improvised with whatever they could find. They stripped 990 20mm anti-aircraft guns from damaged aircraft and positioned them for ground combat. These weapons, designed to fire at high-flying bombers, would now be aimed horizontally at advancing infantry. They scavenged 600 additional machine guns of various types and calibers from depots and warehouses. A handful of 120mm guns, probably coastal defense weapons, were repositioned to cover key approaches. Most ominously, they began converting hundreds of naval bombs and aerial torpedoes into massive improvised mines, burying them under streets and bridges where they could be detonated remotely when American forces approached. Many soldiers found themselves armed with nothing more than spears, crude weapons fashioned by lashing bayonets to bamboo poles or wooden shafts. It was a pathetic arsenal with which to face the most powerful military machine in human history, but Iwabuchi was determined to exact as high a price as possible. Against this backdrop of looming confrontation, MacArthur personally arrived at the command post of the 1st Cavalry Division at Guimba on January 31st, 1945. The 1st Cavalry was not actually a mounted unit, but a conventional infantry division that retained the cavalry designation for historical reasons. MacArthur, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic gesture, ordered an immediate advance on Manila. He wanted speed, he wanted audacity, and he wanted his forces in the capital before the Japanese could complete their preparations. Just after midnight on February 1st, special detachments known as the Flying Columns set out from Guimba. These were fully motorized units built around reconnaissance elements, equipped with jeeps, trucks, and light armored vehicles. They raced south through more than 100 miles of jungle roads, mountain passes, and narrow defiles, moving with a speed that astonished both their own commanders and the scattered Japanese units they bypassed. In just 66 hours of nearly continuous movement, they reached the northern outskirts of Manila, having covered a distance that conventional military wisdom said should have taken at least a week. Close behind the cavalry came the 37th Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had fought through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. They began their march south on February 4th, moving more methodically than the Flying Columns, but with greater combat power. Within days, American forces were pressing into the outer suburbs of Manila, and the Iron Horses, as the cavalry liked to call themselves, were probing the city's defences. MacArthur gave them 3 immediate objectives, each critical to the operation's success. First, they were to rescue the internees being held at Santo Tomas University, where thousands of Allied civilians had been imprisoned since the early days of the Japanese occupation. Second, they needed to seize Malacanang Palace, the official residence of the Philippine president and the symbolic seat of governmental authority. Third, they were to capture the Legislative Building, another powerful symbol of Philippine sovereignty. Speed was essential because MacArthur feared that the Japanese might execute the prisoners if they had warning of the American approach. On the night of February 3rd, troops from the 8th Cavalry Regiment, moving with remarkable stealth and speed, burst through the gates of Santo Tomas University. The compound had been used as an internment camp since January 1942, housing approximately 3,500 prisoners, most of them Americans, but also including British, Dutch, and civilians of other Allied nations. These were businessmen and their families, missionaries, teachers, engineers, and others who had been caught in Manila when the Japanese invaded. For 3 years, they had endured increasingly harsh conditions as Japanese resources dwindled and the guards became more brutal. Rations had been cut repeatedly, medical care was almost non-existent, and the constant uncertainty about their fate had taken a psychological toll that was perhaps even worse than the physical deprivation. The guards on duty that night were mostly Taiwanese auxiliaries who had no particular desire to die for an empire that was clearly collapsing. They offered almost no resistance as American soldiers swept through the compound. The reaction of the prisoners was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Grown men wept openly, women collapsed in relief, and children who had spent years behind wire fences suddenly found themselves embraced by soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. The celebration, however, was premature and dangerous. 63 Japanese soldiers, the core of the Guard force, had barricaded themselves inside the main education building with 275 hostages. They were not prepared to surrender, and they made it clear that they would kill the prisoners if the Americans attempted to storm the building. A tense standoff ensued, with American officers negotiating while their troops maintained a cordon around the building. The negotiations dragged on for more than 40 hours, during which time neither side was certain what the outcome would be. Finally, on February 5th, an agreement was reached and the hostages were released unharmed. The Japanese soldiers were allowed to withdraw from the university, a pragmatic decision that prevented a bloodbath, but left many Americans feeling that justice had not been served. The immediate aftermath of the liberation created new problems that had not been fully anticipated. More than 3,000 emaciated, weakened civilians suddenly needed food, water, medical care, and evacuation from what was rapidly becoming a combat zone. The Americans had brought supplies forward for their own troops, but had not stockpiled the quantities needed to care for so many civilians. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers had demolished the Novaliches Bridge to the north, cutting off one of the main supply routes into Manila and leaving the 1st Cavalry Division short of ammunition, rations and medical supplies. The division was now deep in enemy-held territory with thousands of non-combatants to protect and limited resources with which to do so. Trucks and ambulances were commandeered to begin evacuating the most vulnerable prisoners, but the roads were congested, frequently under fire, and often blocked by debris or blown bridges. As American forces pushed deeper into northern Manila, they encountered the first serious resistance from Iwabuchi's defenders. The Japanese had prepared their positions with considerable skill, compensating for their lack of heavy weapons with clever use of the urban terrain. Narrow streets became killing zones, with mines buried beneath the pavement and barbed wire strung across intersections. Trucks and buses were overturned to create barricades, behind which machine gun teams waited in concealment. Buildings were fortified with sandbags and connected by tunnels so that defenders could move without exposing themselves. Interlocking fields of fire meant that approaching one position would bring soldiers under fire from 2 or 3 others. It was a defensive system that would extract a high price for every block captured. When the 148th Regiment attempted to cross the Estero de la Reina Bridge toward the Pasig River, they discovered just how thoroughly the Japanese had prepared. Mines had been planted on the bridge itself, along with 5 500-pound bombs that could be detonated remotely to drop the entire structure into the water. Fuel storage tanks along the riverbank had been set ablaze, creating walls of flame and thick black smoke that obscured visibility. Machine gun positions on the far bank opened fire as soon as American troops stepped onto the bridge, cutting down the lead elements and forcing the rest to seek cover. The Noguchi Detachment, one of several Japanese units defending the river line, systematically torched buildings along the waterfront to deny cover to the attackers and to create fire breaks that would channel American movements into predetermined killing zones. Military facilities were rigged with explosives so they could be destroyed rather than captured intact. The Americans were forced to pull back temporarily, spending precious hours fighting fires and reorganizing for another attempt. Throughout the northern districts of Manila, Filipino civilians emerged from hiding to greet their liberators with an outpouring of emotion that was both touching and problematic. People who had hidden rice, fruit, and even bottles of pre-war whiskey brought these treasures out to share with the American soldiers. Young women offered kisses and flowers, while old men wept and tried to shake every hand they could reach. Children ran through the streets waving improvised American flags, some of which still bore the 48 stars that had been correct before Alaska and Hawaii achieved statehood. But the chaos of liberation also brought opportunists and looters. Abandoned Japanese stores and warehouses were broken into and stripped of anything valuable. Collaborators who had worked with the occupation authorities were dragged from their homes and beaten, sometimes killed, by angry mobs seeking revenge. This disorder, while understandable given 3 years of brutal occupation, frequently hampered military operations. Troops trying to advance through congested streets found their way blocked by crowds of celebrating or looting civilians. Supply convoys were mobbed by desperate people begging for food. Commanders had to divert soldiers to maintain order and protect property, taking away from the combat strength available for fighting the Japanese. By February 7th, American forces had secured nearly all of Manila north of the Pasig River, that broad waterway that divided the city into northern and southern sections. The Japanese had conducted a fighting withdrawal, contesting each block before falling back to the next defensive line, and now they held only the southern bank. Before abandoning the north, they systematically demolished all 6 bridges spanning the river, dropping their steel spans into the water to deny the Americans easy crossing points. The loss of these bridges was a serious blow to the city's infrastructure and would complicate logistics for weeks to come. Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold, who commanded 14th Corps and thus had overall responsibility for the Manila operation, now had to plan for opposed river crossings followed by urban combat in an area where the Japanese would presumably be even more strongly entrenched. Griswold issued orders that would shape the next phase of the battle. The 37th Division would expand its control eastward along the north bank before forcing a crossing, establishing multiple bridgeheads to prevent the Japanese from concentrating their defence at a single point. Meanwhile, the 1st Cavalry Division would execute a wide, sweeping movement around the eastern edge of the city, crossing the river upstream where resistance might be lighter, then driving south and west to cut off any escape routes and complete the encirclement. It was a sound plan that used American mobility and firepower to maximum advantage while minimizing the need for costly frontal assaults. On February 7th, the 148th and 129th Regiments of the 37th Division began their river crossing operations. Engineers had assembled assault boats and amphibious vehicles, ungainly craft that looked like floating trucks but could carry a squad of infantry across water obstacles. The first wave launched from the northern bank and churned across the muddy water without incident, reaching the opposite shore and establishing a small perimeter. The defenders had apparently not expected such an early crossing and were caught off guard. The second wave, however, was met with a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. Bullets shredded the canvas sides of the boats and splintered the wooden oars. Several craft were hit so badly that they began taking on water. Soldiers grabbed their rifles and used the butts as improvised paddles, while others simply used their hands to scoop water and propel the boats forward. It was desperate, chaotic, and terrifying, but enough men reached the southern bank to expand the bridgehead. The landing site was Malacanang Gardens, a stretch of parkland adjacent to the presidential palace. It had been chosen because it was one of the few places along the river where the southern bank did not rise steeply, allowing the assault boats to beach directly rather than having to scale muddy embankments while under fire. By late afternoon, enough troops had crossed to secure the immediate area, and engineers began working frantically to construct a pontoon bridge that would allow vehicles and heavy equipment to cross. By the following morning, February 8th, a two-lane bridge had been completed, a ribbon of metal pontoons and wooden planking swaying gently in the current. Almost immediately it was overwhelmed, not by military traffic but by hundreds of terrified civilians fleeing the fighting in the southern districts. They streamed across in both directions, some seeking safety in the north, others trying to return to their homes to rescue possessions or find missing family members. The bridge became hopelessly congested, with military police struggling to maintain order and direct traffic while battle raged only blocks away. Once across the Pasig, the 37th Division faced an entirely different kind of warfare. Northern Manila had been relatively open, with wide boulevards and modern buildings that could be bypassed or cleared relatively quickly. The southern districts, however, were older, more densely packed, with narrow streets lined by thick-walled structures that the Japanese had converted into fortresses. Every building was a potential strongpoint, every intersection a deadly ambush site. Iwabuchi's defenders had used the time bought by their comrades' sacrifice to prepare these positions with meticulous care. Sandbags reinforced windows and doorways, walls were loopholed for firing positions, and buildings were connected by tunnels and trenches so that defenders could reinforce threatened positions without exposing themselves. One of the first major obstacles was on Provisor Island, a small landmass in the Pasig that housed the city's steam power plant. The plant was a massive structure of steel and reinforced concrete built to industrial standards that made it nearly impervious to small arms fire. The Japanese had transformed it into a citadel, with machine gun nests covering every approach and bunkers constructed from sandbags and scavenged materials. American troops had to cross open water in assault boats while bullets whipped the surface around them, then storm a building where every room might contain enemies. The interior was a nightmare of dark corridors, steam pipes hot enough to burn exposed skin, and the deafening roar of generators that somehow continued to operate even as the battle raged around them. Soldiers fought hand to hand in the darkness, unable to see their enemies until they were close enough to grapple. The battle for the power plant lasted 2 full days and cost 25 American lives before the last defender was killed and the facility secured. From Provisor Island, the 148th Regiment pressed on into Pandakan, an industrial district of warehouses and factories. Resistance here was surprisingly light, with Japanese forces apparently having decided that these buildings were not worth defending. The Americans moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, because when they reached Paco railway station, they ran into a defensive position that had been prepared with extraordinary thoroughness. The station was a complex of platforms, tracks, warehouses, and administrative buildings that the Japanese had turned into a killing ground. 20mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned to fire horizontally, covered every approach. Reinforced concrete bunkers protected machine gun teams. Slit trenches connected the various positions, allowing defenders to move while remaining concealed. Even the church bell tower overlooking the station had been converted into an observation post from which spotters could direct fire onto American positions. The assault on Paco Station became a grinding, methodical operation that tested American training and courage to the limit. Infantry had to crawl forward yard by yard, using any available cover, while comrades provided suppressing fire. Bazookas were brought forward to blast holes in walls, allowing soldiers to enter buildings without having to charge through defended doorways. Every room had to be cleared, every corner checked, because the Japanese had proven themselves masters of concealment and ambush. The fighting went on for hours, then days, with neither side willing to yield. After 10 separate assaults through clouds of dust and smoke, with buildings collapsing around them and casualties mounting steadily, American troops finally secured Paco Station at 8:45 in the morning on February 8th. The cost had been horrific. 45 men killed and 307 wounded in just 2 days of fighting for a single railway station. It was becoming clear that liberating Manila would be far more costly than anyone had anticipated. From this point forward, the Battle of Manila settled into a grim pattern that would characterize urban combat for generations to come. Individual city blocks became battlefields where hundreds of men fought for days over areas measuring only a few hundred yards across. Buildings were mutually supporting, with defenders in one structure able to fire on Americans attacking another. At first, MacArthur's standing orders restricted the use of artillery within the city limits. The guns could fire only against targets that had been clearly observed and identified, a restriction intended to preserve Manila's historic buildings and minimize civilian casualties. But as American losses mounted and the ferocity of Japanese resistance became apparent, these restrictions were gradually relaxed. On February 10th, the ban was lifted entirely, and thereafter artillery was employed with devastating effect. The pattern of attack became standardized through bitter experience. First, barrages of 105mm and 155mm artillery would pound a target building, shattering windows, collapsing roofs, and hopefully killing or stunning the defenders. Tanks would move forward, firing their main guns point-blank into the lower floors to blow holes in the walls. Flamethrower teams would advance under covering fire, directing streams of burning liquid through windows and doors to incinerate anyone inside. Only then would infantry storm the structure, clearing it room by room with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. Often the first assault would be repelled, forcing the Americans to pull back and repeat the entire process with even heavier artillery fire. It was methodical, brutal, and it worked, but the destruction it caused was immense. One of the most difficult fights was for the new police station on Marqués de Comilla Street, where the Japanese had created a defensive complex that encompassed multiple buildings. The police headquarters itself was a substantial concrete structure, but the Japanese had also fortified a neighbouring shoe factory, a social club and a school, connecting them with trenches and tunnels to create a single massive bastion. Attacking one building would bring fire from all the others, and clearing one position only meant that defenders would retreat through the tunnels and reoccupy it after the Americans moved on. It took 8 solid days of brutal fighting to reduce this complex. Fresh regiments had to be rotated in as the original assault units became too depleted and exhausted to continue. Tanks charged head-on into the buildings, driving through walls to reach the interior. Flamethrowers burned out rooms one by one. Phosphorus grenades, which burned with intense heat and produced choking white smoke, were thrown into basements and upper floors. Artillery shells were called in at danger-close distances, landing so near American positions that troops had to hunker down in foxholes as shrapnel whistled overhead. Room after room was cleared in close combat, with bayonets and trench knives doing work that modern soldiers had thought belonged to history. By the time the complex finally fell, hundreds of men on both sides had been killed within an area of less than 2 city blocks. While the 37th Division ground its way through the southern districts in this fashion, the 1st Cavalry Division was executing its wide envelopment. On February 8th, the 8th and 5th Cavalry Regiments crossed the Pasig River east and south of the main city, moving through areas that were less heavily defended because they were farther from the urban core. The 8th Cavalry took a more direct route while the 5th swung wide through Makati, a district of estates and suburban properties. Both regiments encountered scattered resistance from Japanese units that had been positioned to delay but not to hold. The fighting was sharp but relatively brief, with the Japanese pulling back rather than standing to the death as they were doing in the city centre. On February 10th, the 5th Cavalry captured the Makati power station, an objective that reflected General Kruger's policy of preserving infrastructure wherever possible. Unlike the previous power plant battles, this one was secured with minimal damage because the defenders chose to withdraw rather than fight from within the facility. By February 12th, both cavalry regiments had reached the coast south of Manila, effectively sealing the city from that direction and completing the encirclement. They then turned north along the shore of Manila Bay, preparing to link up with the 37th Division's forces. Along the way, they encountered a series of strong points that the Japanese had established in public buildings and recreational facilities. Harrison Park, a waterfront recreation area, had been fortified with bunkers and trenches. Rizal Stadium, named after the Philippine national hero, had machine gun nests in the stands and snipers in the press boxes. La Salle University, a Catholic educational institution, had been converted into a fortress with the same thoroughness that marked all Japanese defensive preparations. The Americans had to fight for each of these positions, using the same combination of artillery, tanks and flamethrowers that had proven effective elsewhere. At Rizal Stadium, Japanese soldiers had actually dug bunkers into the baseball diamond itself, creating a surreal scene where combat raged on a field that had once echoed with the cheers of sports fans. Flamethrowers were used to burn them out, leaving the field scorched and pitted with craters. On February 16th, the 1st Cavalry Brigade, composed of the 5th and 12th Regiments, was detached from the division and sent to reinforce the 37th Division in the downtown fighting. This reallocation of forces reflected the fact that resistance in the outer districts had largely collapsed, while the city centre remained a fortress. The cavalry regiments advanced on the Manila Hotel, a landmark of the colonial era that had been one of Asia's most luxurious accommodations before the war, and the High Commissioner's residence, the official home of the senior American official during the period when the Philippines had been a U.S. territory. Both buildings had been heavily fortified and would require major assaults to capture, but their seizure would have tremendous symbolic value. In the northern part of the American advance, the 37th Division had already cleared most organized resistance. On February 19th, the exhausted 148th Regiment, which had been in continuous combat for more than 2 weeks, was finally relieved by the fresh 5th Cavalry Regiment. The cavalry pushed into the University of the Philippines Hospital, another civilian facility that the Japanese had converted into a death trap. Bunkers had been constructed in the basements and on the rooftops, with loopholes providing fields of fire that covered all approaches. The defenders had positioned machine guns to create interlocking fire patterns that made it nearly impossible to advance without taking casualties. The battle raged through corridors where the wounded lay helpless in their beds, through operating rooms where surgery tables had been overturned for use as barricades, through storage areas where medical supplies were stacked alongside ammunition. After days of vicious combat, only 75 of the original 250 defenders remained alive, and on the night of February 23rd they committed suicide rather than surrender. More than 7,000 patients, doctors, nurses, and civilians who had been trapped inside the hospital throughout the battle were finally rescued, many of them suffering from wounds, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma of having been caught in the crossfire. With the outer ring secured and northern Manila largely pacified, the Japanese defenders retreated into their final stronghold, Intramuros, the old Spanish walled city that had been the heart of colonial Manila. Intramuros was a fortress in the truest sense, surrounded by stone walls that were 40 feet thick in places and 20 feet high, built in the 16th century to withstand siege and assault. These walls had been constructed by Spanish engineers using coral stone and volcanic rock, materials that were extraordinarily resistant to artillery fire. The Japanese had reinforced the already formidable defences with modern fortifications, creating a position that they believed could hold out indefinitely. Beginning on February 17th, American heavy artillery began a systematic bombardment of Intramuros that would last for days. The guns fired without pause, shells screaming overhead to crash into the ancient stonework. By the morning of February 23rd, more than 7,400 shells of various calibers had been fired into an area of less than 1 square mile. The shells included 105mm and 155mm artillery rounds, 75mm tank gun shells, 4.2-inch mortar bombs, and even massive 8-inch howitzer rounds that weighed more than 200 pounds and could demolish a building with a single hit. The bombardment had blown several gaps in the walls, creating entry points for the assault that was to follow. 10 minutes after the barrage ceased, a smoke screen was laid down to conceal the attacking troops from Japanese observers. The 129th Regiment crossed the Pasig in engineer boats to attack Intramuros from the north, while the 145th Regiment simultaneously breached the eastern walls. The artillery had done its work well, destroying many of the prepared defensive positions and leaving the survivors stunned and disoriented. Progress in the initial assault was surprisingly swift, with American troops quickly penetrating deep into the walled city. But then a new crisis emerged that threatened to turn the successful assault into a humanitarian disaster. Thousands of Filipino civilians suddenly poured into the streets, refugees who had been trapped inside Intramuros throughout the siege. The Japanese had herded more than 2,000 women and children into the Delmonico church, holding them as human shields or perhaps as hostages. These terrified people now surged forward, desperate to escape the battle zone, but with no clear idea of where to go or how to get there. American supply troops were urgently diverted from their normal duties and sent forward with every available truck to evacuate the civilians to safety. The men, however, had been separated from their families and marched away by the Japanese guards. Most of them were taken to Fort Santiago, the ancient Spanish fortress at the northwestern corner of Intramuros, where they were systematically executed by machine gun fire, bayoneting, and beheading. It was one of countless atrocities that marked the final days of the battle. Inside Intramuros, the 129th and 145th Regiments advanced street by street through what had become an urban hellscape. Each narrow lane was a potential killing ground, with dugouts and spider holes concealed in the rubble. The Japanese had prepared elaborate defences despite the artillery bombardment, with backup positions ready for when the primary ones were destroyed. In the northwestern corner of the walled city stood Fort Santiago, which held a special place in Philippine history. The Filipino national hero, José Rizal, had been imprisoned here by the Spanish colonial authorities before his execution in 1896, and the fort had become a symbol of resistance to oppression. Now it was a Japanese strongpoint, a dark labyrinth of cells and tunnels where the defenders had retreated for a final stand. American troops discovered that conventional assault methods were ineffective against the fort's thick stone walls and narrow passages. Instead, they resorted to more brutal tactics. Gasoline and oil were poured through ventilation shafts and ignited, creating fireballs that roared through the underground passages. Phosphorus grenades were thrown into rooms, producing intensely hot flames that consumed the oxygen and left nothing living. Flamethrowers, those terrifying weapons that shot streams of burning napalm, were directed into every opening. The ancient moss-covered stones became scorched and blackened, while smoke so thick it was almost solid poured from every gap and opening. American soldiers had to work in shifts because the heat became unbearable after only a few minutes. After clearing the cell blocks and underground passages with these horrific methods, troops reported Fort Santiago secured by midday on February 25th, though scattered fighting continued for hours afterward. Some Japanese soldiers, desperate and resourceful to the end, attempted deception to survive or create confusion. They stripped uniforms from American dead and dressed in them, carrying M1 rifles and trying to blend in with the attacking forces. Others raised white flags of surrender from buildings like the bell tower of Delmonico Church, waiting until American soldiers approached before opening fire again. These tactics, which violated the laws of war, ensured that no surrender would be accepted and no mercy would be shown. None of these impostors survived their deception. Only 25 Taiwanese auxiliary troops, who had been conscripted unwillingly into Japanese service and had no loyalty to the empire, successfully surrendered and were taken prisoner. Everyone else fought until they were killed. At dawn on February 26th, with Intramuros lost and his command destroyed, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi and his staff committed suicide inside the agriculture building, which had served as his headquarters. They followed the samurai tradition of seppuku, ritual disembowelment, a death considered honorable in Japanese culture but which struck Americans as senseless and wasteful. Iwabuchi's death did not, however, mark the end of the fighting. 3 massive concrete government buildings remained in Japanese hands, and the men defending them were determined to continue the battle regardless of their commander's death. The legislature building, the finance building, and the agriculture building formed a triangle of massive structures along Padre Burgos Avenue, each constructed of reinforced concrete to withstand earthquakes and tropical storms. These same qualities made them extraordinarily difficult to destroy with conventional weapons. Anticipating that American forces would attack from the south, the Japanese had heavily reinforced the southern faces of these buildings, with machine guns at virtually every window, basements filled with sandbags and supplies, and fortified bunkers covering all approaches. On February 25th, the 37th Division's artillery unleashed a massive barrage against all 3 buildings, but in the confusion, some rounds overshot their targets and fell among the positions of the 1st Cavalry Division near the bay. The resulting friendly fire casualties forced commanders to halt the bombardment while forward observers adjusted the aim of the guns. Such incidents were inevitable given the close proximity of friendly forces and the imprecision of artillery fire, but they were nonetheless tragic and frustrating. On February 26th, the 148th Regiment launched an assault on the Legislative Building, a structure that symbolized Philippine democracy and self-governance. The defenders, positioned on upper floors, hurled grenades through holes they had smashed in the floors, raining explosives down on American troops trying to fight their way upward through stairwells and corridors. The casualties were severe enough that the infantry had to withdraw and call for more artillery fire. The building was subjected to another massive bombardment before troops tried again. It was not until February 28th, after multiple assaults and the expenditure of thousands of artillery shells, that the Legislative Building was finally secured. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry had been assigned to take the Agriculture Building, but they immediately ran into problems. The nearby San Luis Terrace apartments were still in Japanese hands, and machine gun fire from that position made it impossible to approach the main target. The cavalry had to divert forces to clear the apartments first, a time-consuming operation that delayed the main assault by more than a day. On February 28th, with the apartments finally secured, the 5th Cavalry was ready to attack the agriculture building. American commanders decided to employ every weapon available in a demonstration of overwhelming firepower. 155mm howitzers were brought forward and positioned to fire point blank, their shells smashing directly into the lower floors of the building at ranges measured in yards rather than miles. Tanks ground forward until their hulls were almost touching the structure's foundation, then fired their main guns repeatedly into the base, attempting to collapse the entire building by destroying its structural supports. Flamethrowers directed streams of burning napalm through windows and doors. Bazookas, shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets, were used to blast holes in walls. Phosphorus grenades, which burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel, were thrown into every opening. The building began to collapse piece by piece, with entire sections of walls crumbling and floors pancaking downward. On March 1st, with the structure reduced to a smoking ruin, American officers called for the defenders to surrender, using loudspeakers to broadcast the demand in both English and Japanese. There was no response except silence. The Americans responded with even more fire, pouring fuel into the wreckage and igniting it to burn out any survivors. Explosives were used to collapse the remaining walls. 2 days later, after yet another artillery barrage, the 148th Regiment stormed the finance building, the last Japanese stronghold. They found the final defenders huddled in an elevator shaft, still refusing to surrender. Grenades and demolition charges were dropped down the shaft, and by dawn on March 3rd, the last resistance had been eliminated. That afternoon, General Griswold sent a message to General Kruger that marked the official end of the battle. All resistance has ended. After exactly 1 month of combat, the Battle of Manila was over. American forces had liberated the capital, but at a cost that stunned even hardened veterans. The true horror of those 3 weeks, however, was not merely in the gunfire and explosions, because as the fighting raged through the city, Japanese naval troops, undisciplined and desperate, had turned their fury on the civilian population. Districts like Tondo, Binondo, and Paco were systematically put to the torch. Women and children were herded into churches, schools, and theatres, then burned alive or blown apart with hand grenades. Men were separated from their families and slaughtered in backyards, alleyways, and garbage pits. Survivor diaries and testimonies collected in the years after the war tell of hundreds of people burned alive in places like Bayview Cathedral and St. Paul's School. Families crawled into sewers, pushing their children through narrow openings in desperate attempts to survive. Some people hid in the fetid water for days, emerging only when they were certain the Japanese had moved on. At the family home of the Quirinos, Japanese soldiers murdered the wife and children of Manuel Roxas, a prominent politician who would later become president of the Philippines. Roxas himself was elsewhere when the attack occurred, and he returned to find his family dead, their bodies mutilated. He screamed helplessly, a sound that neighbours would remember for the rest of their lives. Witness Lourdes Reyes, who survived the massacre and testified years later, recalled seeing Japanese soldiers dragging civilians to the Pasig River, cutting their throats and pushing the bodies into the current. Others who had taken refuge in the Bayview Hotel were subjected to gang rape before being killed. As American artillery fire widened to destroy Japanese strongpoints, civilians trapped in air raid shelters built earlier in the war were crushed when the structures collapsed or burned alive when fires spread through the underground spaces. After the battle, American investigators attempted to determine how many of the civilian deaths were caused by Japanese atrocities and how many resulted from American firepower. The estimates concluded that most deaths came from deliberate Japanese massacres, systematic killings that served no military purpose and violated every principle of civilized warfare. But the reports also acknowledged, often reluctantly, that American artillery had inflicted heavy casualties on civilians. The massive bombardments that preceded each assault, the tank shells fired at point-blank range, the flamethrowers that set entire blocks ablaze, all these weapons were inherently indiscriminate in an urban environment where combatants and non-combatants were impossible to separate. The official figure, compiled from multiple sources and undoubtedly incomplete, was that 100,000 Filipino civilians had died during the battle, a toll that made Manila one of the worst urban disasters of the Second World War, exceeded in the Asian theatre perhaps only by the aerial bombardments of Tokyo and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By March 3, 1945, Manila had been transformed from the Pearl of the Orient into a shattered wasteland of rubble and ruins. The human cost of the battle was staggering on all sides. American forces had suffered 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded, casualties that shocked commanders who had expected a quick liberation. The Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated, with 16,665 confirmed dead, meaning that more than 97% of Iwabuchi's force had been killed. Only a handful of Taiwanese and Korean auxiliaries had surrendered, along with a few wounded Japanese who had been too incapacitated to resist or commit suicide. But the heaviest toll by far had been borne by Manila's civilian population. 100,000 lives lost, 1/10 of the city's pre-war population, families destroyed, children orphaned, an entire generation traumatized. The physical destruction was equally catastrophic. The ancient district of Intramuros, 400 years of Spanish colonial architecture, had been reduced to rubble by American artillery. Churches that had stood since the 16th century were now piles of stone. The Manila Cathedral, seat of the Catholic Archbishop of Manila, had been gutted by fire. Schools, universities, and hospitals lay in ruins. Water systems, electrical grids, and transportation infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. Bridges were down, roads were impassable, telephone lines were cut. The port facilities that had made Manila a commercial hub were wrecked, with sunken ships blocking the harbour and warehouses burned to their foundations. It would take years, perhaps decades, to fully rebuild what had been destroyed in 1 month of combat. In the immediate aftermath, American forces had to transition rapidly from combat operations to occupation and administration. Engineers were put to work building temporary bridges to restore communication across the Pasig River. Mine clearance teams began the dangerous work of locating and defusing the thousands of improvised explosives that the Japanese had planted throughout the city. Military police were posted at every major intersection to prevent looting, though enforcement was difficult given the scale of the disaster and the desperation of the surviving population. Civilians were organized into work gangs to clear rubble from the streets, bury the dead, and salvage anything that could be reused. American soldiers, who had spent weeks fighting for their lives, now found themselves distributing food, setting up medical aid stations, and trying to reunite separated families. Efforts were made to maintain morale among the troops who had fought through the battle. Movies were shown in makeshift theatres, dances were organised with local women who had survived the massacre, hot meals were provided whenever possible. But the reality of occupation duty in a shattered city could not be escaped. The smell of death hung over Manila for weeks, a sickly, sweet odour that permeated everything. Diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread through the refugee camps that had been set up to house the homeless. Children wandered the ruins, searching for parents who would never return. Soldiers who had thought themselves hardened by previous combat found themselves haunted by what they had seen in Manila. The deliberate cruelty, the senseless destruction, the suffering of innocents who had been caught between two armies. From a strictly military perspective, the Battle of Manila provided valuable lessons about urban warfare and the use of combined arms in built-up areas. Even without close air support, which was difficult to employ safely in a city where friendly forces were intermixed with the enemy, American commanders had demonstrated the effectiveness of artillery, armour, and infantry working in coordination. The key breakthrough had come when restrictions on artillery fire were lifted, allowing commanders to employ massive firepower to destroy enemy strongpoints before sending infantry forward. This shift in tactics steadily reduced American casualties from an average of 26 deaths per day in the early phases of the battle to just 6 per day by late February. The price, of course, was paid in destroyed buildings and civilian casualties, a trade-off that troubled many officers, but which seemed militarily necessary given the fanatical resistance they faced. The Japanese defense, for all its determination and courage, had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Admiral Iwabuchi's force had lacked the heavy weapons, communications equipment, and combined arms capability needed for sustained urban defense. They had no tanks to contest American armor, no artillery to suppress American guns, no air support to strike enemy positions, and no prospect of resupply or reinforcement. All they had possessed was willpower, the courage to fight to the death, and the city itself. They had used that city with considerable skill, transforming ordinary buildings into fortresses, digging foxholes into streets and parks, placing machine guns in windows and bell towers, and creating interlocking fields of fire that made every advance costly. But such tactics, no matter how skillfully employed, could not withstand the overwhelming material superiority that the Americans brought to bear. Once American commanders committed to using maximum firepower, the outcome was never in doubt, only the timeline and the scale of destruction. The Battle of Manila held a unique place in the Pacific War as the first and only time that American forces had to conduct a major urban assault against Japanese defenders. Previous battles had been fought on remote islands, in jungles, or in small towns that could be bypassed or leveled without significant strategic consequence. Manila, however, was a major city with historical significance, political importance, and hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Americans could not bypass it, they could not simply bomb it into submission from the air, and they could not allow it to remain in Japanese hands while they advanced elsewhere. They had to take it, block by block, building by building, and they had to do so while trying to minimize casualties to their own troops and to the civilian population. Two objectives that proved impossible to balance in the fury of combat. The liberation of Manila paved the way for the complete recapture of Luzon and eventually the entire Philippine archipelago, but it also exposed the brutal costs of urban warfare in a way that would influence military planning for decades to come. The lessons learned in Manila would be studied by officers who would later fight in places like Hue, Grozny, Fallujah, and Mosul, battles where the same fundamental challenges would recur. How to root out determined defenders from fortified buildings, how to minimize civilian casualties while using overwhelming firepower, how to maintain the humanity of soldiers fighting in an environment where every doorway might conceal an enemy and every decision might result in innocent deaths. The firestorm that consumed Manila in February and early March of 1945 destroyed not only buildings and infrastructure, but also something less tangible, yet equally important, the memory and innocence of an entire generation. Children who survived the battle would carry psychological scars for the rest of their lives, flinching at loud noises, suffering nightmares, struggling with survivors' guilt. Women who had been raped and brutalized found their lives irrevocably changed, many unable to speak of their experiences for decades. Men who had been forced to watch as their families were murdered carried a burden of helplessness and rage that could never be fully resolved. The physical city could be rebuilt, and indeed it was, rising from the ruins to become once again a major metropolis. But the psychological and emotional wounds cut deeper, creating trauma that would be passed down to children and grandchildren who had not experienced the battle but who grew up in its shadow. The Battle of Manila stood as a warning to posterity about the unparalleled devastation that comes when modern war enters a city, when the distinction between combatant and civilian becomes impossible to maintain, and when two forces clash amid the homes and lives of ordinary people. It demonstrated that there are no clean wars, no surgical strikes that leave only the guilty dead and the infrastructure intact. Urban combat is inherently destructive, inherently tragic, and inherently costly to everyone involved. The liberation of Manila saved thousands of prisoners from execution and freed millions of Filipinos from Japanese occupation, objectives that were unquestionably worth pursuing. But the price paid was enormous, a price measured not only in the official casualty figures, but in destroyed families, traumatized survivors, and a city that would never be quite the same as it had been before the fighting began. In the years that followed, memorials would be erected, histories would be written, and veterans would gather to remember their fallen comrades. The Philippines would celebrate its liberation and honour those who had fought to free the islands from occupation. But for the survivors who had lived through those 3 weeks in February and March of 1945, when their city became a battlefield and their homes became graves, the memories could never be entirely put aside. They remained as reminders that peace and life must be cherished, that the decision to wage war, however just the cause, carries consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield, and that the true cost of victory is sometimes almost too terrible to bear. The ruins of Manila in March 1945 spoke eloquently of war's true nature, not glorious or ennobling, but destructive and all-consuming, a force that devours everything in its path and leaves only shattered lives and broken memories in its wake.